Welcome to List Em Out I. Let's dive straight into 10 creepy short stories. Short story 1. The Echoing Knock. It started with a knock. A faint, polite rap on the front door at exactly 3:13 a.m. Emily woke with a start, heart pounding. She lived alone, surrounded by dense woods miles from the nearest neighbor. Ignoring it, she tried to fall back asleep. But the knock came again. 3 short taps. She tiptoed to the door, clutching a heavy flashlight, and peered through the peephole. No one was there. "Pranksters," she muttered, locking the deadbolt. But as she turned away, the knock came again, louder this time. "Who's there?" she demanded. Silence. The peephole revealed only the empty porch. When she backed away, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "Why don't you answer the door?" Emily's blood turned cold. Trembling, she typed back, "Who is this?" The reply was immediate. "Look behind you." She spun around, flashlight trembling in her hand. The living room was empty. But the knocking continued, now echoing through every wall, impossibly loud. And then, it stopped. Emily breathed a sigh of relief. Until she saw it, handprints, dozens of them, smeared across every window, inside and out. They weren't human. Too long, too many fingers. Her phone buzzed again. It's rude to keep guests waiting. Panicked, she called 911, but the line crackled and went dead. The power flickered. In the dark, the knocking resumed, closer now. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from inside her bedroom door. Terrified, Emily barricaded herself in the bathroom. The knocking turned to pounding, and the voice that followed wasn't human. Low, guttural, it whispered her name. It promised her release. Then silence fell again. When morning came, she ventured out cautiously. The house was quiet, but the windows were covered in those unnatural handprints. On her phone, one last message blinked on the screen. Until next time. Short story 2. The Room That Moves. Jason loved his new apartment, though the landlord's warning had been odd. "Don't use the extra room," she'd said, almost pleading. Naturally, Jason had to see for himself. The room was plain, empty except for a single wooden chair in the center. At first, nothing seemed strange. But when he returned from work the next day, the chair had moved, just an inch to the left. He laughed it off, blaming his imagination. Until it happened again, and again. One night, curiosity got the better of him. He set up a camera and let it record. The next morning, he reviewed the footage. The chair moved, but not by itself. A shadowy figure, faceless and distorted, emerged from the wall and dragged the chair across the floor before vanishing. Jason fled the apartment that same day, but he couldn't shake the unease. Nights later, in his new home, he woke to the sound of scraping. In the corner of his bedroom, the same wooden chair stood, its legs dragging slightly across the floor. The shadow had followed him. Determined to understand, Jason researched the history of the apartment. He learned of a tenant who vanished decades ago. Her body was never found, but rumors swirled about a cursed chair tied to her disappearance. Jason tried burning it, burying it, even giving it away. Each time it returned. One night he woke to find himself seated in the chair, unable to move. The shadowy figure loomed over him, its featureless face somehow smiling. Jason screamed, but no sound came. When his neighbors entered days later, all they found was the chair, back in the extra room, and Jason's shadow, frozen against the wall. Short story 3. The Forgotten Name. Maggie found the book at a thrift store, its cover worn and pages yellowed. Inside, the handwritten inscription read, "Say my name, and I am yours." Intrigued, she took it home and began to read. The book was filled with bizarre, unsettling stories, each ending with the same phrase, "Say my name." But the name was never mentioned. That night, Maggie dreamed of a voice whispering to her, soft and insistent, "Say it." When she woke, she couldn't shake the feeling she was being watched. The next day, she noticed the book had changed. New pages had appeared, describing her home, her routine, even the dream. Frantic, she flipped to the last page. Written there, in jagged handwriting, was a name she didn't recognize. Against her better judgment, she whispered it aloud. A chill filled the room, and the lights flickered. The book's pages turned blank, but a single phrase appeared. "Thank you." The whispers in her dreams never stopped. Over time, her reflection began to flicker, as if something else stared back. One night, her shadow whispered her own name back to her, and she realized she hadn't been alone since. As weeks passed, Maggie's world distorted. Mirrors reflected a reality she didn't recognize. Her shadow moved independently, sometimes looming, sometimes shrinking. The book reappeared, its pages filled with scenes of her future, each more horrifying than the last. One evening, she burned the book, hoping to break free, but the whispers only grew louder. Her name was no longer hers. It belonged to whatever she had summoned, and now, it wanted more than her voice. It wanted her. Short Story 4: The Vanishing Neighbor. Every night at 9 o'clock, Sarah's neighbor, Mrs. Hawthorne, would sit by her window, knitting and humming a cheerful tune. It became a comforting ritual for Sarah, seeing her there. Until one night, Mrs. Hawthorne wasn't at the window. Strange, Sarah thought, but didn't worry too much. The next day, she knocked on her neighbor's door. No answer. Peeking inside, Sarah saw the house was spotless but lifeless, as if no one had lived there for years. Confused, she asked the landlord about Mrs. Hawthorne. He frowned. "There's no one by that name here. That house has been vacant for decades." Sarah returned home, heart racing. That night, at exactly 9 o'clock, she looked out her window. Mrs. Hawthorne was back, knitting and humming, but her eyes locked onto Sarah's window. She smiled, a wide, unnatural grin, and waved. The next morning, Sarah woke to find a scarf on her doorstep. The intricate pattern spelled her name. Over the following nights, Mrs. Hawthorne's figure seemed to grow closer, her humming louder, despite the distance. Sarah stopped looking out, but she couldn't ignore the rhythmic tapping on her window. One evening, she peeked outside to find Mrs. Hawthorne standing inches away, knitting with something that glinted, metal wire. The scarf was found wrapped tightly around Sarah's neck. It wasn't yarn, but strands of hair and gleaming thread, her name woven over and over. No one ever moved into the house again. Short Story 5: The Wrong Reflection. Lila hated the old mirror her grandmother had left her. Its ornate frame was cracked, and the glass had a strange, warped quality. But it was a family heirloom, so she kept it. One night, brushing her hair, she noticed her reflection didn't quite match her movements. When she raised her hand, the reflection hesitated, just for a moment, before mimicking her. She stepped closer. Her reflection smiled, though she hadn't. Panicking, she covered the mirror with a sheet and tried to sleep. But in the dead of night, she woke to a faint tapping. The sheet had fallen away, and the reflection was still smiling, tapping on the glass as if asking to be let out. Desperate, she smashed the mirror the next day. Relief washed over her until she glanced at her phone screen and saw her reflection there, smiling back, trapped in every reflective surface she encountered. Weeks passed, and Lila avoided all mirrors, keeping her home devoid of reflective surfaces. But the reflection found other ways. In windows, puddles, even the gleam of her utensils. Each time it was closer, its grin wider. One night, her reflection spoke. "Let me in." Lila screamed, shattering every window. But her reflection didn't vanish. Instead, it emerged from the shards, dragging itself into her world. Now, it lives where she once did, and Lila, she's the one trapped behind the glass, forever smiling. Short Story 6, The Clockmaker's Curse. Everyone in the village knew the clockmaker's shop, but no one dared to enter after dark. It was said that his clocks didn't just tell time, they captured it. One day, Daniel, a traveling merchant, ignored the warnings. The clockmaker, a frail man with piercing eyes, welcomed him in, insisting he purchase one of his creations. Daniel chose an ornate pocket watch, drawn to its unnerving precision. "It will always keep you on time," the clockmaker whispered. From the moment he left the shop, Daniel noticed strange occurrences. Time seemed to slip. Minutes vanished without memory. His days grew shorter, and the watch grew louder, ticking incessantly in his pocket. One night, as the watch's hands struck midnight, Daniel found himself unable to move. Shadows from the clock face crept up his arm, spreading over his body. He tried to scream, but the ticking drowned out his voice. The next morning, the clockmaker opened his shop to display a new creation. A clock with Daniel's face frozen inside, its hands eternally spinning. Short Story 7, The Unfinished Painting. Claire was an art student desperate to stand out. At a flea market, she discovered an unfinished canvas, a haunting portrait of a faceless figure. The vendor claimed it was cursed, but Claire saw potential. She brought it home and began painting, adding details to the figure. Each stroke felt guided by an unseen hand. By nightfall, the figure had a face, but Claire didn't recognize it. It was watching her. The next day, the painting changed. The figure's face mirrored Claire's, but twisted in anguish. No matter how hard she tried to alter it, the painting reverted, its expression growing darker. One morning, Claire woke to find the figure gone from the canvas. Her reflection in the mirror wasn't her own. The figure stared back, smiling. Days later, Claire's friends found her apartment empty. The painting now hung on the wall, fully finished, with Claire's terrified face staring out. Short Story 8, The Whispering Well. In the heart of the forest stood an old well. Locals warned never to approach it, claiming it whispered promises too tempting to ignore. Liam, an adventurous teen, didn't believe the tales. One night, he ventured to the well, eager to prove it was just a story. As he leaned over the edge, he heard it, a voice, soft and soothing, calling his name. The voice promised him everything he desired: wealth, love, power. All he had to do was lower the bucket and pull it up. Against his better judgment, Liam obeyed. The bucket returned empty, but the voice laughed. Over the next weeks, Liam's life unraveled. Friends turned on him, his family grew distant, and shadows lingered at the edges of his vision. Desperate, he returned to the well, begging for answers. The voice replied, its tone mocking, "You asked for everything. Now you have nothing." Liam's scream echoed through the forest as the ground beneath him crumbled, pulling him into the well. No one ever found him, but locals swear they hear his screams mingled with the whispers. Short Story 9, The Dollhouse. When Lily's grandmother passed, she inherited a dollhouse, a perfect replica of the family home. Each room was intricately detailed, right down to the tiny portraits on the walls. One evening, while inspecting it, Lily noticed something odd. The tiny figurine in the living room was missing. Moments later, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her brother. "I'm stuck." His call went dead before she could respond. Panicking, she checked the dollhouse again. The living room now had a new figurine, a miniature version of her brother, seated on the couch, terror etched into its tiny face. Over the next days, more family members vanished. Each time, a new figurine appeared in the dollhouse. Lily tried destroying it, but it wouldn't burn, crack, or splinter. One night, Lily felt herself shrinking. She screamed as the world grew larger around her. The last thing she saw was the giant dollhouse looming above her and her own tiny figure trapped inside. Short Story 10, The Library of Lost Things. Marianne loved books, so when a new library opened in town, she was thrilled. The librarian, an old woman with clouded eyes, handed her a library card, warning her never to borrow from the basement. Curiosity got the better of her. Marianne descended into the basement one quiet afternoon. The books there were unlike anything she'd seen, bound in strange materials, their titles unreadable. One book seemed to call to her. She opened it and saw her name written across the pages, detailing her life in eerie accuracy. Flipping to the final chapter, she froze. It described her death in the very room she stood in. As she turned to leave, the basement door slammed shut. Shadows writhed between the shelves, and whispers filled the air. The book's pages flipped furiously until it reached the end. Marianne's scream echoed, then silence. The library reopened the next day, and a new book appeared on the shelves. Its title, The Last Chapter of Marianne. That's it for today's Top 10. We're still a new channel, so please give us feedback in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. See you next time.